And welcome to another episode of The Bible, My Cats, and I. I hope you're having a good day today. Mine's been a little bit crazy, and so if you hear any ambient noise in the background, just ignore it. Move on from there. It's bound to happen. It's just been one of those days. I'm going to start out today's lesson with a story from my childhood. When I was in middle school, I had a best friend, and we were absolutely inseparable. We were just a couple of silly, giggly girls. We knew each other so well that we actually developed our own little language that nobody else would understand. Just the two of us would understand what we were talking about. All we had to do was just repeat a series of letters, and it would send us into peals of laughter and giggles. See, each letter was the first letter of a word in a sentence. And those sentences were based on, just past experiences or inside jokes or whatever. So we might turn to the other and say something like, BACU, and we would just start to laugh because we knew what that meant. We knew what it stood for. Now, am I going to tell you what it stood for? Boys are cute, usually? No, that wasn't it. Or, I don't know, Batman acts crazy underwater? No, that wasn't it. Better ask a college undergraduate. No, I'm never going to tell you what it meant. But anyway, we had this language, and only the two of us would understand it. My point is that my friend and I understood perfectly what the letters meant because we spoke that language together. We had both lived in the same context of our silliness and our experiences. So others had a hard time understanding what it was that we were saying. We would just say these letters out and start laughing, and others would scratch their heads wondering what the heck, there they are just being silly, giggly girls again. But it meant something to us. So had they actually, other people, shared our experiences and taken the time to learn our language, then when we said something like that, then they too could have joined in with the laughter because they would have understood what we were talking about. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about historical, cultural, and social context. It helps to know what the historical, cultural, and social context is in order to understand someone else's writings, let's say, or someone else's words. So when it comes to the Bible, that's how it's very important to understand the context. Now, there's another type of context. It's called literary context, and that's what the actual word means within the context of the words that were written. So as you're reading a storyline, the entirety of the story helps you to understand even just one paragraph of it. Let me give you an example. Take the word trunk. Now, trunk can mean a lot of different things, right? Trunk can mean that thing which comes down the big nose off of an elephant, or it can mean the center section of a tree, that really sturdiest part before it goes up and breaks off into branches. Or it can mean also that thing in the back of the car that opens up and you can throw your groceries in there. It can also mean a big box that you can store things in. And trunk can also mean even something like a swimming suit. So it has a lot of different meanings, and you have to have the context to know what meaning that is. Let me give you an example. I'll read these words. She hesitated. Then she reached out to touch the trunk with her hand. Okay, so this is something touchable. It was bumpy and rough. Ooh, there are a few different meanings of trunk that could be bumpy and rough. She sensed it had to have been at least a couple 100 years old. Oh, well, that narrows it down what trunk might mean, doesn't it? Yeah. Hidden away where few people venture to enter. That really narrows it down. Could it be a tree or could it be the box? Hard to say. Her mind began to race with thoughts of what it might hold inside. Oh, it's something that holds things inside of it. We're talking about the trunk that's a kind of a box. See, we understand within that context that then she can go and loosen the latch and open the lid, because we understand it was the box that held things inside that was the trunk that we were talking about. Okay, so that's a literary context. So today we're going to be talking about both of those two different kinds of things. I'll say the historical, cultural, social context. That's what I was talking about in a previous lecture when we talked about the three dimensions of reading the text. There's the behind the text. The historical, cultural, and social context is the behind the text sort of stuff that you want to learn. And then the literary context, what the words mean within the writings themselves. We often forget about this, and we try to take the words of the Bible and make them fit into our own modern or postmodern understanding of things. The problem is that the words weren't written directly to our modern context. I'm not saying that the words don't apply to us, don't get me wrong, but the words were originally written within a different context. We need to read them in that original context that the author meant as the author was writing the words, as well as the way that the audience would have heard those words and understood them. And then we can grasp the full meaning of the text, and it's not until then that we can apply that meaning to our own life circumstances. We don't want to turn it the other way around, and we need to be aware of trying to force the words of the ancient scriptures into our own context. There's this saying that goes, text without context is pretext. And you see, pretext means trying to make those words fit into our own presuppositions. So we want to make sure that we don't do that when we come to read the Bible. The books of the Bible, they're not all really books. Some of them are letters, some of them are poetry, etc. But I'm just going to call them the books. The books of the Bible were written in ancient times within an ancient Middle Eastern paradigm. So, for example, in order to understand what Paul is saying in his letters to the various churches, we need to understand and take into consideration the Jewish expectation of Messiah for redemption as well as for vindication. Now, Paul is still going to be difficult at times. Even Peter said that Paul was difficult to understand. But if you don't read Paul within the context of those Jewish expectations, you're not going to get what he says. We must also have a grasp on what was going on within the Roman Empire at the time. Only when we hold up what God has done through Jesus, the Son of God, against the time, only then, and the backdrop of what was going on with Rome and Israel at the time, only then can we more fully understand what Paul was talking about. The more you understand about what was going on behind the text, the more the text then is going to open up to you and become alive and become clearer and have more meaning to you. So reading the books of the Bible in context is, I can't stress enough how important that is. So it's best to start reading whatever it is that you want to study. Take the book, the whole book, and sit and read the whole book first. Now, I know a lot of the books are too long for you to be able to do that, especially in our busy lives today. But you can sit down and read the Gospel of Mark, for instance, in about 2.5 hours or so. Dedicate some time to it. Sit down and read the whole thing. You can certainly do that with the minor prophets or with the letters in the New Testament. You can sit down and read them in one sitting. That's a really great place to start. That will give you sort of a foundational feel for what the letter or what the book is all about. And then you can start to answer some of the general questions about the context. Now, by general questions, I mean the who, what, when, where, and why questions. A lot of those you can kind of answer yourself by having read the book. You can guess as to who would have written it and to whom they wrote it. What's the general feel? What's the structure? You can sort of get some of those who's and what's. Then there are the whys or the wheres or the, maybe some historical context that you want to find out. If you can't get that out of the scripture itself, there are some great tools you can use. I highly recommend that you should have a study Bible. At the very beginning of a study Bible, it will give you some of those who, what, when, where, and why answers to your questions to help lay the context of what this book, why it was written and by whom, etc. There are also a lot of tools that are online that you can do. I love to use Blue Letter Bible or Bible Gateway. There are so many of them though. And they will offer you some of this background information as well as some commentaries, etc. I also hardly ever sit down to study my Bible without a commentary as well, sitting right next to me so I can refer to that. So these are places that you can go in order to get some of those contextual questions answered for you. I'm going to give you an example. Pangerband's in the background, by the way, meowing away. You might be able to hear him, and that's just the way it is. Hold on just a second. Here is my study Bible, and I'm just going to read you some parts of the very introductory information that I have at the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke. It tells me the authorship. Luke, the beloved physician, the close friend and companion of Paul. That's the Luke that was referred to in Acts. He was probably the only Gentile author of any part of the New Testament. Interesting. Okay, so he's Gentile. He was the physician, so he was well educated and probably pretty interested in facts, and he could probably write really well. He was Gentile. He was of Greek background. That becomes really interesting because we begin to understand that actually Luke was probably writing to a Greek context. As far as methodology is concerned, he says in the very beginning paragraph of his gospel that he undertook some really great scholarship and he talked to eyewitnesses. So he's trying to bring about a more factual presentation of the experience of Jesus and his ministry and his mission here on earth. He also is writing to someone called Theophilus. We don't know, the meaning of Theophilus is friend of God. We don't know if that was an actual person or whether he's saying, I'm writing this to you, oh friend of God. Not sure, but it's pretty clear that Theophilus was probably a patron of Luke, and so he's writing to a particular person. He has a rather distinctive approach because he's writing to the Gentiles, and some of the things that this says that he emphasizes is compassion. Jesus' compassion on the world. He's the one that has the stories about the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. You'll see a lot of reading in his writings about the poor and women and the oppressed, etc. So this is really interesting information that you can kind of have under your belt before you go into a study of Luke. All right, I'll set that aside as that example. Now, I shouldn't have put that down because I'm going to talk about the importance of literary context as well. I want to give to you, there's so many examples of literary context that I could give you. It was hard to choose, but I chose to pick one from the Gospel of Mark because I think it's pretty clear. If you go to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, if you go to verse 22, there's this story about Jesus healing a blind man in Bethsaida. And so the blind man begged Jesus to touch him. It says here, he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. So he really couldn't see very clearly, it sounds like. And then verse 25, once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, don't go into the village. Now, what was that all about? It makes us ask questions like, well, why didn't Jesus just heal him all at once the first time he touched him? Or maybe Jesus couldn't heal him all at once. And we start to wonder, why is this? But then if we take that little section and we read what comes before it and we read what comes after it, it might add a little clarity as to why it was that Mark wrote this into his account of the gospel. What comes right before is when Jesus tries to teach his disciples to be careful. And he says, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. He's saying they don't really get it, and watch what their teaching is. But the disciples, it says, really didn't understand what he was talking about. And they thought that he was talking about bread. And he explained to them, no, that's why are you even talking about bread? So here's this example of Jesus trying to teach something, and the disciples just aren't understanding it. They aren't getting what it is that he's talking about. All right, that's what comes before our text about the blind man. What comes after our text? Jesus and his disciples, this is in verse 27, Jesus and his disciples went on to the village around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, who do the people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? And Peter answered, you are the Christ. Peter gets it. Peter understands. Now, he doesn't understand fully because he goes on to deny Jesus later, but he gets that. So he goes from being with Jesus, talking about beware of the Pharisees and their teaching and not understanding what he's talking about, through to the point where he understands now. Now back to our little part about the blind man seeing. To see something is a metaphor for understanding something. And so I believe that this is Mark using the literary context here to make a point. That we hear and see what Jesus is doing in our own lives and in the lives of others. But it takes stages. It takes a while. It takes many touches from Jesus into our lives for us to come to a full understanding. Understanding comes in stages, in the same way that sight came in stages to the blind man. So do you see how literary context can really help open our eyes to understanding that particular section of Scripture? I encourage you, if there is a section that you don't understand, be sure to read what comes before and to read what comes after. All right? I'm not promising, but it should help. Here's another example that I just want to throw out here as a final example. In 1 Corinthians, chapter 14, verses 34, there's discussion about women in the church. There's some assumptions that are made about this letter. And one of those assumptions has to be that it's a two-way conversation. Remember, the letter, you're only getting one half of that conversation. So when you're reading a letter, always assume, oh yeah, there's somebody on the other side. And there may have even been questions from that other party that sent questions to Paul, and Paul was answering something to their questions. There are a few letters that are in the New Testament that are called the general letters, and they were letters meant to be sent to all of the churches. But for Paul's writings, they're letters that were sent to a particular people at a particular time under certain circumstances. So we have to look back into the context of that to understand what the circumstances were. Unfortunately, something that's often done is things are taken out of context, including this writing in chapter 14 about women, and assuming instead of this being for a particular situation that church of Corinth is experiencing, they're making generalizations and making it more universal. It's interesting, in the very same letter, in chapter 11, it talks about how women should wear hair coverings. Why is that not considered to be universal? Why aren't all women wearing hair coverings in churches today? By golly. But here in chapter 14, we seem to think that it's still okay to make that a universal principle, what he says about women not talking in the church. I could go on and on about this, and maybe I will for a lesson at another time. But again, this is one of those instances where context, both historical and literal context, is really important. When you read that passage, be sure to read what he says before when he's talking about speaking in tongues, and what he says right after when he says, what? We have no such practices. All right, there you go. When you're reading any part of the Bible, you want to make sure that you consider the context, both the historical, cultural, and social context, and the literary context in which it is written. Text without context is pretext. I hope you have a wonderful week. Blessings to you, grace and peace. Hi again. So I thought I'd add in a little postscript here to my last message, or a little epilogue, if you will. Since we were talking about context, I thought this would be a good time for me to throw this in. A lot of people have been asking me, why do you call this the Bible, My Cats and I? I mean, obviously I have cats and I've introduced them in previous lessons and such, but why did I come up with that name? Well, here's where the context is really important to understand. When I first got into this video conferencing or video seminars, I had my whole setup, but I forgot and I left the door open. And so in the middle of teaching a lesson, in comes Pangerban running into the room, and Zoe right behind him, chasing him. And the whole camera system and the mic all shook and everything. And so I realize now that there's no beating that. Somehow the cats are going to make their presence known. Here's a little shot of some of the really glamorous behind the scenes stuff. You can see where they're climbing on the boxes that I use for a podium here in my house. We have a really fancy setup here, okay? Anyway, if there's no beating them, then you might as well just invite them in, and that's why I call it the Bible, My Cats and I, because they're gonna be a part of this. So if you see things shaking around, you can just giggle and you know that the cats are in here somehow. All right, be blessed. Have a wonderful week.